lawn. When confronted, she shrugged, claiming, "I thought they were abandoned." But Brian knew better. Karen, in her late 40s, blonde and always looking down on everyone, had taken them. What she didn't know was that Brian had security cameras, and those cameras caught everything. Her lies were about to unravel, and Brian wasn't going to let her get away with it. She had no idea what was coming. But that's a story for later. Let's start from the beginning. It was early Tuesday morning when Brian Thompson pulled his car into the driveway after his routine morning at the office. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns of his suburban neighborhood. His small, yet well-kept house stood proudly at the end of the block, with a row of vibrant flowers lining the front yard and a few rustling trees swaying in the gentle breeze. It was an ordinary neighborhood, the kind that felt safe, predictable, until this morning. As Brian stepped out of his car, his gaze naturally shifted toward the front of his house, where his 2 trash cans typically stood, one green for recyclables, one gray for regular waste. But as his eyes scanned the driveway, something felt wrong. His trash cans weren't where they were supposed to be. Confusion flickered across his face, and he walked toward the curb, his eyes narrowing. He checked both sides of the driveway, peering into the neighbors' yards, hoping to spot them somewhere out of sight. But then his stomach dropped. In front of Karen Simmons's house, the neighbor he had always found overly critical, were his trash cans, sitting proudly on her pristine lawn. Karen, a woman in her mid-40s, was well known in the neighborhood for her need to control everything. She prided herself on having the perfect home and often had something to say about the way others maintained their properties. Her impeccable front yard and meticulously pruned bushes were her crowning achievements. Her hair, always perfectly styled, was a golden blonde, and her sharp blue eyes had a way of sizing people up. She wore a crisp white blouse and high-waisted jeans when she tended to her garden, exuding an air of superiority. Brian, a father of 2 young children, had always kept to himself, but had exchanged pleasantries with Karen on occasion. But this wasn't a casual misunderstanding. This was outright theft. His trash cans, which had been outside his house every week for years, had been taken without permission and placed in Karen's yard. The audacity of it hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the cans. His immediate instinct was to march over there and demand them back, but part of him hesitated. Could it really be an accident? Maybe it was a mistake, he thought, though the nagging feeling in his gut said otherwise. Without further hesitation, Brian walked up to Karen's front door, his fists clenched by his sides. As he knocked, he noticed the meticulous landscaping again, the neatly cut hedges, the perfectly trimmed lawn, things he couldn't afford to pay as much attention to. His kids loved to play in their backyard, and he'd often have to keep an eye on them, making sure they didn't stray into the street. The door opened, and there stood Karen, with her usual self-assured smile, as though she had all the answers in the world. "Oh, Brian, what brings you by this early?" Karen said, her tone light, but there was an unmistakable glint of arrogance in her eyes. "Karen," Brian started, keeping his voice calm, "those trash cans are mine. You took them from my driveway. Why?" Karen's smile faltered slightly, though she quickly regained her composure. "Oh no, Brian. I didn't realize they were yours. I thought they were just left here by mistake. I've been meaning to get some new ones, you know. I thought I'd just use yours until I get around to it." Brian's heart raced as she spoke. He knew she was lying. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. He could see it in the way she avoided eye contact and kept shifting her weight between her feet. The trash cans had his name on them, his family's name, etched into the side of each one. "I don't buy that for a second, Karen," Brian said, his frustration rising. "Those are mine. You can't just take my things and claim them as yours." "Oh, come on," she replied, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness.
"It's not a big deal, Brian. Don't make such a fuss. Just take them back and everything will be fine."
Brian's jaw tightened. There was no way he was letting this go. He had worked hard for everything he owned, and Karen was not going to get away with stealing his property.
"Fine,"
Brian said, walking back toward his driveway, his blood still boiling. "But don't think this is over." He was determined to get his trash cans back, but deep down he knew this was more than just about trash. It was about standing up for himself, for his family, and for his right to live in peace without someone like Karen trying to take advantage of him. As he stood at his driveway, staring at the spot where his trash cans used to be, he realized this was just the beginning. There was no turning back now. Brian's anger only deepened over the next few days as he stewed over Karen's audacity. He started taking action. He walked up to the local security office and reviewed the footage from the cameras near his house. Sure enough, the footage showed Karen, in broad daylight, walking across his lawn and wheeling his trash cans away. He felt vindicated, but also more determined. He needed to confront Karen with undeniable proof, and he wasn't going to back down now. The next evening, Brian knocked on Karen's door, holding a tablet showing the footage of her taking the cans. "Karen, I have the footage right here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You took my trash cans, and now you're going to return them." Karen's face twisted with annoyance.
"I don't have time for your nonsense, Brian," she sneered. "Those cans were abandoned. I simply took what I thought was mine."
Brian felt a sharp pang of frustration. She was still lying, trying to wiggle out of the situation. "Don't think this will be swept under the rug. I'm taking this to the HOA. But that wasn't enough. The HOA, as usual, was indifferent, siding with Karen, a member in good standing. But Brian wasn't going to let it go. It was time for him to play his trump card. Brian consulted with a lawyer, determined to prove that Karen had stolen his property. He sent a letter to the HOA demanding that they act and pointing out how Karen's actions had violated the neighborhood's rules. But the HOA responded with apathy, as if Karen had some sort of immunity. Karen, now feeling emboldened by the HOA's lack of action, began mocking Brian whenever they crossed paths. She'd smirk at him from her porch, calling him petty. "You can't prove anything, Brian. Just let it go," she would say, taunting him. But Brian wasn't backing down. He gathered his evidence, strengthened his case with the security footage, and presented it to the HOA board one last time, this time with the threat of legal action. The HOA finally agreed to investigate. They convened a meeting, and as the video was played for the board, Karen's smug confidence crumbled. She tried to interrupt, but her excuses were weak and unconvincing. Her lies were exposed. The HOA had no choice but to act after seeing the irrefutable evidence. Karen was forced to return the trash cans and publicly apologize to Brian. The HOA issued a formal reprimand, and it became clear that Karen's reputation in the neighborhood